Good afternoon, everyone. So, this week's theme is all about imperialism. We're going to be looking at how American foreign policy is changing in the late 19th century and how America kind of begins to take its place as an imperialistic power during this period, in which countries of Europe, other countries of Europe, are also kind of flexing their imperialistic muscles. And America definitely, kind of wants to get in on that action as well. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to talk about some of the motivations behind the push toward imperialism in the late 19th century. Then we'll get into looking at specific examples of American imperialism. We'll look at some of the consequences and some of the pushback against imperialism, which is going to kind of go into what we're going to be covering later on this week, the debate between imperialism and anti-imperialism, and sort of this question of how does America become an imperial power? So to start us off, I want to talk about some of the factors driving American expansion during this era. And primarily, the main thing that was really driving expansion is economics. Economic reasons drove this period of expansion. The second industrial revolution that's going on, that we've already discussed, was really the main catalyst for this expansionary outlook that develops in the late 19th century. The transition, as we've seen, the transition to this industrial economy created a lot of instability, economic instability and also social instability. The depressions during the 1880s and 1890s were much more severe than economic downturns had been before the Civil War. During the years when the economy was expanding, manufacturers would flood the market with goods. And then because you have this oversupply, you kind of this pattern of falling prices and a lot of competition between producers, encouraging overproduction. Once the market becomes saturated, sales and profits start to decline, the economy spirals downward, production slows, workers get laid off, farm prices plummet. Eventually, the economy bottoms out, but in the meantime, there's a lot of deprivation and hardship. And people were really afraid during this period for what the future might hold for the American economy. It's not really clear how real this threat of overproduction actually was, but it seemed very real to people at the time. So a lot of people are looking for a solution to this problem. With all of this increased production of manufactured goods, agricultural products, the U.S. needed markets, needed to find places to sell these goods, and many people looked to expand foreign trade to alleviate this problem of overproduction. So while all of this economic expansion, this overproduction, these boom and bust economic cycles are going on, we see American exports and foreign investment dramatically increasing. In 1895, the amount of goods that Americans exported was valued at about 800 million. By 1914, that number had gone up to $2.3 billion every year. That was an increase of nearly 240%. This increase in exports was made possible by this extensive transportation network that had been put in place, all of these technological advances that were being made, scientific innovation, and very aggressive marketing as well. Technological advances were especially important for both increased agricultural production, but also for manufactured goods. Uh, so you see, as production increases, they need a place, farmers need a place to sell these, sort of their crops. And so they begin to call for opening up foreign markets. And mass production, marketing techniques pioneered by American industrialists were also exported along with the goods. In 1898, Senator Albert Beveridge put it this way. He said, American factories are making more than the American people can use. American soil is producing more than they can consume. Fate has written our policy for us. The trade of the world must and shall be ours. So we have a lot of exporting going on, a lot of trade going on. We also have investment going on as well. This acceleration of American investments abroad quadruples in the 1890s and the early part of the 20th century. And this is the basis for a lot of today's huge international corporations. You got a lot of mergers during this period, new forms of corporate organization. And, corporations are looking to circumvent tariffs. They're looking to move closer to raw materials or markets. And this fuels this growth in foreign investment. So investors also believed that what they were doing abroad was modernizing. They, sort of believed that they were promoting global social and political progress. The Secretary of State under Teddy Roosevelt once said that our surplus energy is beginning to look beyond our own borders throughout the world to find opportunity for the profitable use of our surplus capital, foreign markets for our manufactures, foreign mines to be developed, foreign bridges and railroads and public works to be built, foreign rivers to be turned into electric power and light. Or to put it this way, a railroad executive speaking at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair said, "We blow the whistle that's heard round the world, and all peoples stop to heed and welcome it. Its resonance is the diplomacy of peace. The locomotive bell is the true Liberty Bell, proclaiming commercial freedom. Its boilers and the reservoirs are the forces of civilization. Its wheels are the wheels of progress, and its headlight is the illumination of dark countries." So that's a kind of interesting quote there if you think about the implications really of what he's saying. So most of this economic expansion was really concentrated in what America considered to be its traditional sphere of influence, the Western Hemisphere. So a lot of this activity is concentrated in Latin America, South America, the Caribbean. And this brings us to this idea of banana republics. And I'm not talking about the store here. A banana republic is a pejorative term for a small country that is politically unstable, that is dependent upon limited agriculture, that tends to be ruled by a small, wealthy, corrupt oligarchy, and that gets economically exploited by foreign interests. This term was actually coined by an American author, the author O. Henry, in 1904. And he was actually referring to American interest in Honduras at the time. So when he called this a banana republic, during his era was often a euphemism for a dictatorship, as it sometimes still is. And of course, calling them banana republics implied that, it's kind of reliant upon basic agriculture, being sort of backward in technology. A real example of this, all of this foreign investment meant that private American citizens had a lot of control over the territory and the infrastructure, especially in these Latin American nations like Costa Rica, Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala. An example of this was the sort of someone who is known as the uncrowned king of Central America, a man named Minor Keith, who helped to dominate industry and the economy of Costa Rica. Minor Keith had gone down to Costa Rica to create a railroad in 1873. This project of building the railroad in Costa Rica took 19 years, and it took hundreds of lives. When Costa Rica defaulted on loans that it had taken out for building this railroad, the Costa Rican government gave Minor Keith ownership of the tracks and about 80,000 acres of land alongside the railroad tracks. Keith says, okay, I'm going to turn around, I'm going to plant bananas on this land. So he begins to make an enormous amount of money exporting bananas along these railroad tracks, which he also basically owns, to ports along the Atlantic. He becomes so wealthy, so influential, he actually marries the daughter of the former Costa Rican president. And in 1883, he takes over some of the British land that was owned in Costa Rica. He ends up getting about 7% of all the land in Costa Rica. In 1899, his company merges with another company to create a huge corporation called the United Fruit Company. This was the largest banana company in the world. United Fruit pretty soon owned all different kinds of industry. They owned mines and ranches and plantations and the railroad in countries like Honduras and Colombia and Costa Rica and Cuba and Jamaica, Nicaragua, Panama. They also owned a huge fleet of ships. They called it the Great White Fleet. And they were actually operating one of the first cruise lines in the Caribbean. This picture here, the food value of the banana, this is a pamphlet published by the United Fruit Company in 1928 promoting the consumption of bananas by Americans. Prior to 1870, bananas were not something you could get in the United States. The UFC, the United Fruit Company, controlled about 75% of banana sales in the U.S. In 1883, about 110,000 bunches of bananas were exported by the UFC. 7 years later, their exports were up to 1 million. By 1907, it was up to over 10 million. By the way, the United Fruit Company is still in operation today. It changed its name in 1990. It's now known as Chiquita Brands International. So we have a lot of foreign corporate investments, private enterprise promoting kind of, American influence abroad. We also have direct attempts to convert foreigners to Christianity and the American way of life by missionaries promoting expansion as well. This was kind of this cultural counterpart to the economic expansion. A lot of the missionary efforts in the late 19th century tended to concentrate primarily upon Asia, particularly China, also Africa and the Middle East as well. And American missionaries were sent to these different countries not only to spread Christianity, but also to spread Western culture. And there was definitely a racial component to this as well. They were sent here to, as they put it, civilize these backward peoples. There's a real sort of faith in and belief in the superiority of Anglo-Saxon Christian, civilization. And there's a real sort of idea of the white man's burden here. And so missionaries also sort of claimed and very consciously linked themselves to this economic expansion. They flourished mainly in port cities. They had a lot of success in converting people in these cities who were trading with American businessmen and who were employed by American businesses. They claimed very consciously that their work was opening up new markets. And because of this, they got a lot of donations and a lot of charitable support from wealthy businessmen. These sort of examples, you can see a group of missionaries. This is taken in 1891, and they are dressed in traditional Chinese clothing, which I think is a very interesting photo that they chose to take here. And this other sort of brochure on the right here, this is from the American Missionary Association, dated 1880. And it's a little hard to read, but the banner below in the middle of the picture here says, "They are rising, all are rising, the black and white together." So I think this really sort of depicts this belief among missionaries that their project of converting people around the world would benefit both Americans, but also the foreigners themselves. All of these expansionary tactics were carried on by private citizens, private interests. So what was the role that the American federal government was playing? Well, it's really designed to kind of promote these private impulses. And the government basically had to decide how are, we going to, sort of promote this. So in the late 19th century, the American government developed these techniques to try to help and assist citizens who were operating abroad and promote economic and cultural expansion. And so this is all being fueled partly by a definite, kind of white supremacist ideology. There's this real concept of this Anglo-Saxon racial mission around the world. And this is really sort of summed up here by this other quote by Senator Albert Beveridge. He said that God has made us adept in government, that we may administer government among savage and senile peoples. So this was not out of keeping with what the rest of what the American government was doing during this era. In the late 19th century, as we've seen, governmental power was very much invested in dominating or crushing ethnic groups, ethnic minority groups that were threatening that white supremacist ideology. The last great Native American resistance was put down at Wounded Knee in 1890. Southern state governments, through the complicity of the Supreme Court and the northern states, began to enforce Jim Crow apartheid against black citizens. In northern cities, you've got the power of the government clashing with strikers, and many of these sort of people who were striking were immigrants. And so you have, kind of this going on as well. Out in the West, there are lots of immigration restriction laws enacted against Chinese Americans. So these concepts of this racial mission had been very well rehearsed at home, and this was very easily transferred overseas. Great example of this, Theodore Roosevelt. He once said that when the U.S. government fought what he called wars with barbarous or semi-barbarous peoples, that the U.S. government was not being warlike or violating peace, but exercising what he said was a most regrettable but necessary international police duty, which must be performed for the sake of the welfare of mankind. So there was a lot of debate that went on in the late 19th century over how the United States should spread American civilization around the world. Some people believed that only force could bring these quote unquote backward nations into civilization. Others sought to conquer the world more peacefully through culture and education and commerce. Most Americans agreed that they didn't want to become a traditional colonial power like Great Britain. So the US, as we're going to see, finds a slightly different way to gain an empire. Not through colonization, but through creating protectorates, through making economic treaties, businesses, voluntary associations like missionary groups. We're going out, spreading America's economic and cultural dominance, and the government should be assisting these efforts. Now, there is a lot of expansion of the American military during this period as well. One particularly influential individual was a man named Alfred Thayer Mahan. He writes a very important book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History in 1890. And in this book, he argues for building up the American Navy. He said, well, sort of in order to be a major world power, we have to have control over the oceans. And so he advocated America developing colonies in the Caribbean and the Pacific. He advocated building a canal to link the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And building up, sort of in 1890, his ideas were very influential on the presidential administration at the time, the Harrison administration. So in 1890, Congress authorizes the construction of 3 large battleships. Gradually, the U.S. builds up its naval capability to match its growing economic power. By 1910, the American naval budget is up to $181 million. Now, the U.S. needs routes and places to send these new ships. Having all this new naval power means that we have both the means but also the motive to acquire foreign territories. So, particularly proponents of this are looking to islands throughout the world, islands, the islands of Hawaii, islands in the South Pacific, islands in the Caribbean, to be places where these ships can dock, coaling stations, places where, sort of the sailors and the merchants who are on these ships can, rest and recover. So it's really sort of, looking to these islands. And particularly the island of Hawaii becomes a really interesting example of this. The islands of Hawaii. American missionaries had come to Hawaii in the 1820s, and they found there that the Hawaiian islands were governed in this kind of feudal system. There was a king, and sort of lots of kind of nobility, and they were sort of kind of land was owned in this kind of feudal system. The missionaries ended up converting the Hawaiian rulers to Christianity. They became translators and advisors for them. A lot of course, the native religion and culture of the islands became detrimentally affected by this. These missionaries also brought in American ideas about property ownership. And so as a result, Europeans and Americans begin to acquire large amounts of land on the Hawaiian Islands. And they realize that they can make huge profits growing sugar and tropical fruits. So sugar plantations after 1879 begin to explode. Sugar plantations brought jobs and workers from all over the world, from the Philippines, from Japan, from Portugal, to work on these sugar plantations. And a lot of the, kind of Hawaiian culture develops out of this. For example, it's Portuguese workers who bring the ukulele to Hawaii. Between 1879 and 1885, annual sugar production goes from $1.3 million to $8.4 million. And by the 1890s, Americans and Europeans own about 2/3 of the entire Hawaiian Islands. And they begin to argue that, we own all this land, we need to be part of the United States in some way. In 1891, anti-American groups in Hawaii, groups who want to preserve Hawaii for its native population, bring a woman named Queen Liliuokalani to the throne. And she had, according to one American diplomat, extreme notions of sovereign authority. She ascends to the throne after her brother dies in 1891, and she's very interested in preserving Hawaii for the native peoples. She and the plantation owners struggle for power until 1893, when she issues a constitution that greatly enlarges her power. This causes pro-annexation forces to move to depose her with the help of the American Navy. So in January of 1893, these annexationists seize power, and they basically, depose Queen Liliuokalani. They declare for a sort of new Hawaiian republic with Sanford B. Dole, as in Dole pineapples, appointed as president. This new Republic of Hawaii is immediately recognized by the United States government. And Queen Liliuokalani ends up, sort of getting, arrested. She gets, kind of essentially deposed from her rule. And after 1898, the annexation of Hawaii as an official territory of the United States gets approved. So this brings us to this pivotal year, 1898. This is a really kind of important year in the history of American foreign policy. And it's an important year because it's the year that we go to war against Spain. So why do we go to war against Spain? Well, it all has to do with Cuba, the island of Cuba. Spain, of course, had been a very sort of strong imperial power in the Caribbean and in South America, but by the late 19th century, they are struggling. The Spanish are struggling to hold on to their last remaining colonial holdings. And particularly Cuba was, sort of a very had been struggling for its independence for years against the Spanish. The Cuban revolt flares up again in 1895, and the Spanish government responds by sending a man named General Weyler, his nickname was the Butcher, with troops to Cuba to brutally suppress this rebellion. Weyler begins putting the Cuban people into what he called reconcentration camps. And Americans are outraged at this. There's all these sensationalist newspapers in the United States who are, of course, competing for readership. They start to print horrifying stories of the atrocities that the Spanish are committing in Cuba. Now, the struggle of the Cuban people against the Spanish really appeals to kind of American ideals, right? America sees itself as the protector of the weak, the defender of the right of peoples to self-determination. We're the original revolutionaries. And we're also motivated by humanitarian concerns. Americans hold rallies to raise money and food and call for the Spanish to institute reforms. But Americans are also self-interested here. American companies are heavily invested in sugar plantations on the island of Cuba. By 1897, the trade that we had going with Cuba was about $27 million a year. And so the U.S. wants to ensure a stable environment for these investments and protect the sugar plantations that are owned by Americans on the island of Cuba. Eventually, Spain recalls General Weyler, brings him back to, and kind of, tries to make peace with the Cuban rebels. Early in 1898, it seemed like the Spanish were beginning to lose control over Cuba. There are riots going on in Havana. And President McKinley assumes that Spain is no longer going to be able to maintain order. So he sends an American battleship, the battleship Maine, to Havana, ostensibly on a goodwill mission, but really he sends it there to protect American citizens and property from all of this chaos that's going on. So this battleship is sent to Havana to protect American interests, threatened by all of the Spanish inability to put down this Cuban rebellion. And on February 15th, 1898, an explosion destroys the Maine. 266 American sailors are killed. Now, it's not clear what caused the explosion, at least immediately it's not clear. They thought that maybe it happened outside the ship, but it really wasn't clear what had happened. 80 years later, in 1983, an investigation concluded that it had probably been an accident, that the explosion had probably occurred inside the ship, probably a boiler blowing up or something like that. Although it was probably an accident, the sinking of the Maine really inflames Americans who are advocating to go to war. Newspapers practicing this yellow journalism, this sort of sensationalist headlines and, kind of trying to attract readers, offered rewards for who could discover who had sunk the Maine. They come up with this enduring slogan, "Remember the Maine." And they, of course, leap to this conclusion that this was all because the Spanish had sabotaged. It was a Spanish mine, and they were trying to, kind of attack us. So the press had been, sort of printing stories like this for years, but it's really not helping to pacify the growing number of Americans who are calling for war. And all of this sort of, push really helps to shape American public opinion. Some in the United States are really preparing to capitalize on the impending conflict with Spain. After the Maine is sunk, the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, who happened to be Theodore Roosevelt, he sends a message to the commander of America's Pacific Fleet, Commodore Dewey. He orders him to load up his fleet of ships with coal and to sail to the Philippines in the event of the United States going to war with Spain. Roosevelt had been trying to get his boss, the Secretary of the Navy, for over a year to begin to draw up plans to attack the Philippines. He has this idea. He really wants to assert American power abroad. He's very willing to enlarge the Navy. And all of this public outcry over the Maine really drowns out President McKinley's efforts to try to avoid going to war. This becomes a highly political issue as well. There are midterm elections coming up. McKinley's going to run for re-election in a couple of years. And, it really seems like McKinley is kind of being forced into going to war. So he, sends a message to Congress on April 11th, 1898, basically saying, yeah, we should probably declare war. Congress debates this for a couple of weeks. Not whether to declare war, but whether to recognize Cuba as an independent nation. And they eventually adopt this compromise position, the Teller Amendment, which says that the United States hereby disclaims any disposition or intention to exercise sovereignty, jurisdiction, or control over Cuba, except for the pacification thereof. So it's this kind of compromise between those who say, yeah, we should, annex Cuba, and those who are a little bit more reluctant. The war lasts about 3 months. The Secretary of State, John Hay, he called it a splendid little war. The Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Teddy Roosevelt, he promptly resigns his post and he gets ready to lead a cavalry unit, the Rough Riders, into the war. This, of course, is a famous painting by Frederick Remington, The Charge of the Rough Riders at San Juan Hill, really representing this kind of jingoistic nationalism that is sweeping the country during this time. Americans flocked to enlist, including several all-male colleges who all volunteered en masse. Roosevelt's aide wrote President McKinley, he said, "Our men represent every phase of American life. Ultra-fashionables from New York, men from the north, south, east, west, ranchmen, cowboys, miners, professions. In fact, pretty much every variety of American manhood." And an interesting side effect of the war was that it really helped to cement relations between the North and the South. This is, of course, remember, this is just a little over 30 years since the end of the Civil War. The nation is still trying to heal from this very difficult conflict. So the war in Cuba gives Americans from both the North and the South a common enemy against which to fight. The U.S. Navy was vastly superior to the Spanish. The Army, however, was not prepared to actually go to war. On May 1st, Admiral Dewey destroys the Spanish ships in Manila in the Philippines. American troops invade Cuba in June. The Spanish fleet there is destroyed in Santiago Harbor. The Spanish ends up surrendering on July 17th. A week later, American troops take the island of Puerto Rico, with only 3 American lives lost. They sign an armistice with Spain in August, and totaled only about 460 Americans were killed in battle, but over 5,000 died of disease. The casualties among the Cubans were much, much higher. The war was not the kind of splendid little war that Hay had described. There were severe supply problems. The Army did not have enough weapons and ammunition. They weren't wearing the right kind of uniforms to fight in this tropical country. They had these tropical diseases which killed 5 times as many Americans as bullets did. And there was also racial problems within the Army as well. This is a photograph of a segregated company of African-American soldiers. A significant proportion of the American invasion force in Cuba were black. Some of these were volunteer troops put together by black communities, and others were members of the 4 black regiments in the regular army. Black Americans were very sympathetic to the struggle of the Cuban people. One soldier wrote, "At last we have taken up the sword to enforce the divine rights of a people who have been unjustly treated." But as Black soldiers traveled through the South toward training camps, they encountered a lot of segregation and occasionally violence. Racial tensions continued in Cuba. Nearly half of the Cuban insurgents were Black, but they were fully integrated into the Cuban rebel army. And whereas African American soldiers had to fight in these segregated units. So it was a really interesting conflict in that respect. Now, this also leads us into a less remembered war, the war in the Philippines, the Philippine-American War. American troops who were sent to the Philippines to occupy the islands there quickly encountered the troops of Emilio Aguinaldo, who had led the fight for the Philippines' independence against Spain just a few years prior. Aguinaldo was a brilliant military leader. He was ardently nationalistic. He really wanted to secure independence for his country. And U.S. troops are fighting alongside Aguinaldo's forces initially. But once it becomes clear that the Americans have no intention of withdrawing after they have won the war against Spain, tensions begin to mount. And things begin to explode in February of 1899. Pretty quickly, there is a new war developing. And the ensuing war in the Philippines really ended up becoming dominated by guerrilla warfare. Over 4,000 Americans died in the war. Perhaps 200,000 Filipinos died either through war or through the famine and disease caused by the war. There were atrocities committed on both sides. Gradually, the American military effort in the Philippines became more and more brutal. A lot of captured forces were executed. On some islands, entire villages were evacuated and destroyed. American forces ended up using torture on rebels who were captured. And the United States doesn't end up granting full independence to the Philippines until 1946. All right, so we've won this war against Spain. Now this means we have to confront this problem of what to do with all of this new territory that we've acquired. The Treaty of Paris, signed in December of 1898, grants the United States control over Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Now, Cuba and Puerto Rico are close to the United States, and that seemed to kind of fit our sense of ourselves as this dominant power in the Western Hemisphere. But the Philippines is another story. It's this territory, very densely populated, large territory, thousands of miles away. This seems to be very different and much more problematic to a lot of people. So there's a lot of resistance to annexation. This powerful anti-imperialist movement arises throughout the country to oppose American annexation of the Philippines. And we're going to explore the anti-imperialist movement and the arguments that were made later this week. The anti-imperialists made lots of different arguments. Some believed that imperialism was immoral. Some believed that some had racial reasons. Some argued it was against American values. Some feared polluting the American population with quote-unquote inferior races. So there are lots of different sort of components to this anti-imperialist movement. And we're going to explore these, sort of later on. The pro-annexationists were, imperialists like Teddy Roosevelt. They saw the acquisition of an empire as a way to keep alive all the benefits of war. Businessmen see opportunities in the Philippines. A lot of people sort of argued that this was, sort of a partisan issue as well. Eventually, the pro-imperialist forces end up, kind of triumphing. And the Senate finally ratifies the treaty, annexing all of this new territory in February of 1899. Now, After defeating the Spanish in Cuba, American forces occupying the country begin essentially, to use a more modern term, nation building. And as you can see, McKinley and his running mate, his new running mate, Theodore Roosevelt, campaigned on the apparent success in Cuba in the 1900 presidential election. As you can see here, it's sort of touting the administration's promises have been kept. And it's saying, sort of in 1896, there was this Spanish rule in Cuba, and the Cuban people were horribly oppressed and imprisoned. Now Americans are in control in Cuba, and everything is, going great for the Cubans. When the Cubans end up drawing up a constitution that does not make any reference to the United States, Congress passes a piece of legislation known as the Platt Amendment in 1901, which is basically pressuring Cuba to incorporate its terms into the Constitution. The Platt Amendment barred Cuba from making international treaties, which basically gives the United States control over Cuban foreign policy. It gives the United States the right to intervene in Cuba to preserve Cuba's independence, life, and property. And it requires Cuba to allow the United States to have a naval stations. This is when we get the station at Guantanamo Bay. American investors in Cuba begin buying up plantations and factories and railroads and refineries there. And there's a lot of resistance to this on the part of the Cuban people. Occasionally, this provokes revolts against the Cuban government. And sometimes these revolts prompt the United States to intervene militarily. American troops occupied the island of Cuba from 1906 to 1909, and they come back again in 1912 to put down a revolt by plantation workers. So this process of having to kind of govern and, construct reforms in Cuba was a bit more difficult than perhaps the United States had bargained for. McKinley ends up defeating his anti-imperialist opponent, William Jennings Bryan, in 1900. And this election, McKinley's victory in 1900, is really seen as a vindication of American imperialism. Teddy Roosevelt had, sort of been picked as McKinley's vice president. He had risen after the war in Cuba. He had very quickly risen in political prominence. He'd become the governor of New York. And so to eliminate his rapid rise, Republican Party officials said, okay, we'll make him vice president. Vice president, of course, is a position which doesn't tend to have a lot of power. But 6 months into McKinley's second term, he is assassinated. And now, said one party leader, that damned cowboy is president of the United States. Roosevelt had long been an imperialist. He was very influenced by social Darwinism, ideas about this nature being a struggle for survival. He called the American ideal as a nation of men, not weaklings. And he believed that having a strong military was a sign of national greatness and also racial superiority. He definitely had, sort of kind of very social Darwinist, very, kind of white supremacist ideas. Roosevelt, of course, believed in using American power in the world. His famous sort of, slogan was, speak softly, but carry a big stick. And you can see that reflected here in this political cartoon where you've got Roosevelt striding around the Caribbean Sea, followed by the American fleet, and he's carrying his big club there. He believed in this hierarchy of quote-unquote civilized and uncivilized nations, and he really was able to kind of consolidate executive power through his very personal style of diplomacy. He kind of sets a precedent for all American presidents since then, in that he, sort of really decided to play a huge role in foreign affairs and really consolidating the power of the presidency. So now America has acquired all of this new territory. And we really have to figure out what are we going to do with it. Particularly, how are we going to see ourselves as an imperial power? So, in a series of cases decided by the Supreme Court in 1901, the court decided what was going to be done with these new islands acquired by the United States. And the court decides that the native peoples of Hawaii and Puerto Rico would achieve citizenship and constitutional rights only when Congress said that they were ready for it. These cases determined which territories would be put on a path towards statehood and which would be kept in this status as unincorporated territories. These were called the insular cases. That means it signifies that these territories were islands that were administered by the War Department's Bureau of Insular Affairs. And these sort of insular cases, this decision made by the Supreme Court in 1901 is still the thing that governs these territories that the United States has. The Philippines, of course, resisted American rule, but other areas did not, and the U.S. had to work out sort of a new relationship to them. Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Guam, the Virgin Islands, American Samoa, all of these locations accepted government by the United States, but Congress was reluctant to treat them as territories that could eventually become states. So Congress, therefore, invents this kind of new status, somewhere between colony and territory. So this is kind of a way for the United States to hide its empire and settle this debate between imperialists and anti-imperialists by making a compromise between them. The new peoples of these territories would have some rights, but not the full rights as American citizens. And only Congress could say when they would be granted full rights. And to this day, most of these areas controlled by the United States are still in this limbo status. So the debate between imperialists and anti-imperialists was settled in this way, and imperialists basically end up winning the day, almost by default. But the views and arguments of the anti-imperialists are not going to completely go away, and we still see some of these arguments being made to criticize American foreign policy today. So we are going to be exploring that later this week. So for those of you in my on-site class, before coming to class on October 2nd, make sure that you've read Chapter 19 in the American Yop. Make sure to complete the reading quiz as well. There is a set of pro- and anti-imperialist political cartoons online that I would like you to review, and we're going to be discussing them in class on Wednesday. And also your 14th Amendment project bibliography is also due this week. So if you have any questions about that, you can ask me about it in class, and you can also send me an email. For those of you in my online course, again, make sure to read the chapter and do the reading quiz. And the pro and anti-imperialist cartoons are also available on Blackboard for you to review as well for our discussion this week. All right, again, if you have any questions about anything, please do email me or post them in the discussion forum. And I hope everybody has a wonderful week. Take care.